gentlemen, welcome back to the Bank of Baroda front lawn for the next session, The Art of the Novel on Writing Fiction. And we have a stellar lineup for you in this panel with Amy Tan, Chika Unigwe, Helen Fielding, Joshua Ferris, and Michael Ondaatje in conversation with Chandrahas Choudhury. This session is presented by Amity University, and it's my great honor to introduce the speakers to you. Amy Tan is the author of the best-selling The Joy Luck Club, as well as The Valley of Amazement, The Kitchen God's Wife, The 100 Secret Senses, The Bonesetter's Daughter, The Opposite of Fate, and 2 children's books. Her latest book is her memoir, Where the Past Begins. Chika Unigwe was born in Nigeria and is the author of 4 novels, including On Black Sisters Street and Night Dancer. A recipient of several awards, her works have been translated into multiple languages as varied as Polish, Japanese, Hebrew, and Hungarian. Joshua Ferris is the best-selling author of Then We Came to the End, The Unnamed, and To Rise Again at a Decent Hour. He has been a finalist for the National Book Award, shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and is the winner of the International Dylan Thomas Prize. Michael Ondaatje is the author of novels, poetry, memoir, and non-fiction. His works include The English Patient, Anil's Ghost, and The Cat's Table. He has received the Man Booker Prize, the Governor General's Award, and the Prix Médicis Étranger for his fiction, amongst other awards. His new novel, Warlight, will be out in May. And Helen Fielding, I believe, will join us a couple of minutes late. She's an English novelist, journalist, and screenwriter, best known as the creator of Bridget Jones, one of the most iconic female fictional characters of the 20th century. And finally, the moderator for the session is Chandrahas Choudhury, author of the novel Clouds, which was released earlier this month and is already receiving great acclaim. So, please join me in welcoming to the stage Amy Tan, Chika Unigwe, Joshua Ferris, Michael Ondaatje, Chandrahas Choudhury. Helen Fielding will join us in a moment, and this session is presented by Amity University.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello. A novel is one of the most distinctive things that a human being can produce in this world, one of the most artisanal things. It involves a feeling for life and a feeling for language, a need to tell stories, and a feeling for music and tempo. So it involves a lot of skills together. Helen Fielding. Helen went to the wrong tent, which seems like something that Bridget Jones might also have done. So we have in front of you today 5 great exponents of the novel. And without wasting any time, I'm going to start with Amy Tan. Amy, a book of yours that still reads just as freshly as the day when it came out 30 years ago is The Joy Luck Club. And what's so beautiful about it is that it has these 8 characters, 4 mothers and 4 daughters in America, or Chinese American. And there's 2 Joy Luck Clubs in the book. There's one original Joy Luck Club that they set up, the 4 older ladies set up back in China, which was in a very difficult time during the Japanese invasion. And they set that club up, to eat and to tell stories, 2 of the things that human beings do best together. And when they are then transplanted to America, they set up another club, but this time it's not a defense against despair, but against a kind of loneliness because they are alone with the Chinese language while their daughters are more American and speak American and kind of look down upon them a little bit. Did this idea for this wonderful story come to you fully formed, or what did you have to do to make it all come together?
You know, I think the first book was the easiest because you have this pent-up desire to express something. And I had the scare of almost losing my mother to a heart attack, or what I perceived to be a heart attack. So I had questions that framed the book. And things like, what would I have not known had she died? Or what did she teach me about self-esteem or balance? In my mind, there were these things, as well as images in each one of those stories. And I was able to write an outline and then write intuitively without the idea that I was going to be published and receive bad reviews. And I think that makes a huge difference when writing a novel, especially a first one. And everything has been terrible ever since. You know, it's been very difficult without any structure in how I write.
Helen, to you. Bridget Jones's, your great book is unusual in two ways in the modern novel, I feel. One, that it began life not in book form but in a newspaper. And two, that when it first appeared, that there was no mention of the author's name. She was, if that's right, there was at no place did it appear in the diary that Helen Fielding was a writer of these stories. And so, how did you move from that to what we see in the book?
Yes, it was indeed a newspaper column. I was trying to be a serious novelist and writing an unreadable, dull tome about cultural divides in the Caribbean. And the newspaper asked me to write a column as myself, sort of single girl in London. And I said, no, that's exposing and embarrassing, but I'll write under someone else's name, a fictional character. So, of course, when it became popular, because I'm quite shallow, I started saying it's me. But then it was really exaggerated, so they thought it was me anyway, and it was all worse. But that's how that sort of began. But it's not unusual for novels to be written in episodic newspaper forms. Charles Dickens, not that I'm comparing myself with him, but he wrote in episodes. And I think it's quite a good way of telling a story because it's quite tight and you can't really afford to bore the reader every week. So you've got to have a little shape to it, a bit like a sitcom, an A story and a B story. And I found it was a good discipline.
Did you, though, when you were first publishing the newspapers, feel that you had to bring in topical events, allusions to things that were happening that day, that week? Does one write differently for a newspaper audience, and did you have to take things out when you put them onto a book?
Yeah, I took most of them out. I mean, there were some of them which remained reasonably topical, or that just placed it in a period of time. I wrote a thing about the Tory party in England, how it was full of bossy, braying men sitting at shiny dinner tables and going out shooting poof, 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 and not caring about the poor, which has often been quoted as a sort of cartoonish image of the Tory party. And I wrote about Princess Diana's death. I had Bridget go down to where they were laying out the flowers. So those things I kept in the book because I think they placed them and they were important things in the zeitgeist, if you like.
Joshua, one thing that unites your work with Helen is that both of you are comic observers of that place where much of modern life is lived, the workplace, the office. But when you wrote your novel, then we came to the end. What's very unusual about it from the very first page is that it's told not in the first person or the third person, but in the first person plural. A we, a kind of choric group inside the office would describe office life as a group. And then as the voice goes on, you see the group splintering into bits. So tell us, is that we foundational to how that book is written? And without it, would it have been another kind of book altogether?
Such a good question. Thank you for that. The first time that I probably noticed that people used the we was my father, who went off and started his own business. And he was an operation of one. But in his voicemail, he said, we've stepped out of the office, but if you leave a message, we'll get back to you as soon as we possibly can. And I scrutinized that, and I said to him, who's this we? And he said very reasonably, when you're an office of one, you can't admit to that. You have to be larger or people won't trust you and they won't give you your business. So after he went bankrupt, I reflected upon this and I realized that to some extent, there's always a bit of dishonesty when you are presenting yourself as a business enterprise. This sort of coincided with the fact that everywhere that I would look on billboards and in advertisements, I would find companies always talking in the we. You know, we are doing this for you, we hope the best for you. And I started to be very skeptical of these we claims. At the same time, I really didn't know how to speak with any great authority about the experiences that I was having in the advertising world. It seemed that I was often confused and uncertain, not only about my existence and why I was there in the office, but also sort of my safety as an employee. I never knew when I was going to be fired or let go. And so the we voice actually allowed me to talk as if I had that authority, and then I could enter the characters and undermine that authority at will. So it allowed me to tell that story in a way that I felt was both structurally accurate, because companies are always talking in the we, and allowed me to tell it from a novelist's point of view.
There's one drop in register, though, in that book. There's one chapter in which a person is about to die, that is told in the third person. Why did you change that small bit?
I think that arrives at a page 180, and by the time you've had 180 pages of we, you're very ready to settle into one particular character. So I sort of felt structurally and temporally, and just sort of like intuitively, it's time to really delve deep now to give a counterpoint to that more flip, comedic, collective voice.
Chika, there is a kind of we in your book as well, but that's a different we. It's a we of solidarities. And there is the sense in reading your work that what you're trying to do, and it's the same with Amy, is tell stories that are new to our world, that are specific to our world today, our globalized world today. And especially on Black Sister Street, which is the story of 4 sex workers from Nigeria in Antwerp. Tell us how you came to that story, and in trying to write these characters, what's very nice about them is that they all, although it looks from the outside that they are oppressed and there against their will, each one of them has made a different kind of gamble with life. They're there for reasons that they themselves know best why. So how did you come to writing that?
Well, thank you for the question. I'll start by answering the first part of your question. I'm terribly curious. I'm a very inquisitive person, and I'm also very nosy. So I'm the person who eavesdrops on conversations, on the train, on the bus, people talking, I always listen. And I grew up in a very conservative Catholic home in Nigeria, and growing up, one of my favorite songs was Salt and Pepper's Let's Talk About Sex, Baby, but I wasn't allowed to sing it at home. Okay, so one of my favorite songs growing up was Salt and Pepper's Let's Talk About Sex, Baby, and but I wasn't allowed to sing it because of the sex in it. And so to be able to sing that song, I had to replace sex with bread. Like, oh, let's talk about bread, baby.
Let's talk about bread, baby.
Yeah. Because that was the only way I could sing it. And so to move from that sort of background to Belgium after college, when I married, and we moved to Belgium, to see sex very open, So if you take the train, no matter what time of day, and you go past Brussels North, you'd see the women in display windows waiting for clients. So that was a huge cultural shock. And then when I heard that a lot of the African prostitutes or sex workers in Antwerp come from Nigeria, my curiosity, knew no bounds. And so I had to tell that story for myself, to satisfy my curiosity. And to be able to do that, not having any knowledge of sex workers or the red light district, the only way I could do that was by doing some research And so I dragged my husband and we went to the red light district. And I spoke to the women like the women in my book, because that was the only way I could write them truthfully. And one of the things I found out in doing the research was that the narrative that we often hear of sex workers, especially sex workers coming from certain parts of the world, is always a narrative of victimhood. But many of the women I spoke to did not see themselves as victims. They saw themselves as having a certain level of agency. And I wanted to tell their story as truthfully as I could, even though I was writing fiction.
In that story, clearly your remit as a novelist is not to show the reader that one cannot be so easily judgmental of your protagonist, but at the same time, the women all judge each other according to different criteria. So that is something subtle you have to work out, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, people are judgmental. It's human nature to be judgmental. I'm judging you right now, as you're probably judging me. So.
I'd better be on my best behavior.
But to be able to write that novel, because I went into the research with preconceived notions, and I came out completely changed. You know, one of the things that I realized is that shame is a luxury. You know, because going in, I thought, how can they do this? How do you come all the way from Nigeria to come and work in the red light district of Europe? And I also realized that it's very easy when you have choices, when you have options, to pass judgment on other people. And I had to forget everything I learned or everything I thought I knew about the sex industry, everything I thought I knew about prostitution, sort of become a tabula rasa to be able to write that novel as truthfully as I could. It was very important to me not to judge them. And it was also very important to me not to have the readers judge them as well.
Michael, your novels have some of the most distinctive narrative techniques that have been seen in modern fiction. But you say that you like reading old-fashioned novels. It's just that you can't imagine yourself writing them. What is the tension there? Do you feel that the novel itself demands of every practitioner that you cannot repeat what has been done before?
No, I'm sure you can repeat what was done before, and if I could do that, I'd do it. But I began as a poet, and so my first 4 or 5 years of writing was in writing poems where the process is discovery. You don't begin a poem knowing how it will end. You don't begin a poem knowing the whole path of it. So it is an act of discovery and indecision, and then you discover something at the end. And I think when I began to write fiction, I kept that same tendency. I think with a plot, you can go two ways. You can have the plot plotted out beforehand and preconceived, as you said. But also, I think a plot can evolve. And for me, as a writer, it's much more interesting to discover the story as you're writing. And it means you do a lot of work as an editor later on. And so that the editing, which perhaps should have been there at the beginning, happens at the end. But for me, to write a novel is a kind of reconnaissance. And in that sense, you're discovering things you didn't know. You're doing research. You're discovering something about bomb disposal. You then somehow work that into the book. And I think, it's also perhaps related to having written a memoir where you talk your uncle or your aunt or your brother and discover something new, and then you have to work that into the thing. And so in a way, the novels are also a bit like that. They're kind of welcoming in other possibilities of a voice as well as situation.
But what draws you, I cannot find, and this is very good about your work, I cannot find a clear line between your protagonists in different books, The Wild West, a musician in jazz. What is it, but if you could take any one example of one of your protagonists and say what it was about their subjectivity that made you think, I want to recreate this from their inside, their experience in this kind of work.
Yeah, I think partly because my life has been quite nomadic. I'm interested in the next life. I'm interested. I grew up in Sri Lanka with this strange, surreal passion for westerns, and when I lived in England, I had a passion for jazz. So I was interested in early jazz, and so I researched the figure of Buddy Bolden, and I'm not quite sure what it is that draws me to them. I tend to like, with the English Patient, I like the laconicness of this central character who doesn't really say very much and doesn't reveal himself openly. So for me as a writer, I prefer a central character who is complex, and I have to discover him the way an archaeologist discovers, a series of bones, and then try and work out the adventure behind that story.
Amy, one of the pleasures of the Joy Luck Club is that all the characters say some extremely sly things about each other. One of them says of another that she's not hard of hearing, what she's hard of is listening. And that's not something that when one reads the book, one could say about you. You're a very good listener, it's very clear. But I wanted to ask you, one of the difficult things about writing a story is that one can hear a story, one can listen to somebody's story, one can have ears for that and find it very moving. But when it comes to repeating it on the page, it's much harder to achieve the same effects. And so is there something that you found out in writing these stories up about how to write moving stories without sentimentality? What for you is the line there?
With that first book, it really was fairly unconscious. I wasn't doing this with any idea that I had to create a certain voice and not make it sentimental. The mother's voices were the most, they were easier to write than the daughter's voices, and I think that I enjoyed the subterfuge of a mother who I was not. I've never had children, a wise decision. And I found that when I was writing, that this voice that I heard, which was in effect my mother's, came out quite naturally. And all these kinds of expressions were, in fact, the kinds of things that she would have said. Not that she said them, but it was almost as though, I hate this term, channeling somebody, but it was as though in my subconscious, from years of having it ingrained in me 1,000 times with my mother telling me all the things that could go wrong in my life and how I could be, smashed and mutilated and, and how I would have gone crazy. The ways of her thinking just came out naturally. And I think that's what we, as writers, we try to strive for something that seems like the character naturally would have said that without our struggling to find, and mold it that way. So that as I said before, that was the easiest book for me to write because it's just, all these intuitions just came into play with the writing of that book.
Another writer once said to me that the actual work of writing is one of the most unstimulating and unsensual things that one could do. Sit in front, often on a laptop, in front of a blank screen and try and work up a vision of life. But you seem like somebody, always when you read, like someone who seems to know how to write with all five senses. When you read a page of your prose, there's so many different kinds of sensual details that are evoked in that. Is that something you always knew how to do, or is that something you learned?
I think as writers, I'm going to use the imperial we, that we often have our particular observations. We are, in fact, people who observe and have our own cosmology, and we put that into our writing. And so for me, I was forced, in a way, to look and observe in all the senses, whether it was from my mother, from cooking, but also as the child who entered into a different school every year and having to accommodate what the new environment was. And you start picking out everything that is significant. When you're an oversensitive child, you look for every single clue. And that, in effect, became quite useful as a writer, that you're just by habit used to looking at nuance and deriving meaning from that. And then you can use those things and embed them, and try not to embed them in some artificial way, where the artifice shows. But it comes from years of noticing. And then hopefully it comes up through this natural, intuitive process in writing.
Helen, one of the things that novelists must do, and it seems that something the novel is naturally destined for, is that you show not only how life changes, how society changes, but how language itself changes. And many of the words and phrases that pop up in Bridget Jones's diary have become part of the culture of modern relationships, or the vocabulary of modern relationships, emotional fuckwitage, and so many others. Were those words that you made up or that you picked up from? So I'm wondering where the origins of these words are. And my other question was the idea that at the head of every diary entry there's this cigarette, alcohol, and calorie counter. Where did you come up with that device? Because it tells you so much already about how the day has gone. In a way, has it been a disaster? Has it been very good?
The sad lists of calories and alcohol units actually came from an equally sad thing, which was my diaries at university. And I was looking through them for inspiration, and there really weren't any social engagements, but all there were these lists of food. So it would be, and they started off so well, it would be yogurt, 100 calories, carrot, 15 calories, 3 olives, 45 calories, and then at the end of the day, 9 glasses of wine and 1 box of milk tray, 4,876 calories. So I just thought that just told us such a lot about her, i.e. me, that it was quite a good little device. And then you could adapt it to negative thoughts or number of calls not come from Daniel Cleaver and things like that. And I've forgotten what the other question was.
The new words that come up.
Oh, the new words. Well, the worst one actually was singleton, and I was delighted to discover that there is actually a singleton bar within the festival.
In the author's land,
yes. Yes, but I coined that word, I thought, because there wasn't a word for a woman who was single in her 30s. By choice. It was an embarrassing thing. You were Miss Havisham. You were going to die and be found 3 weeks later, half-eaten by a dog. And so there were a lot of socio-economic reasons why we were single in our 30s. And it was about time that there was a proper identity for those women. And so I came up with this word singleton. Only to find several years later, after again I'd been boasting about it, that it was actually P.G. Wodehouse, who had long had a thing at his house parties, that the singletons were the ones who got the rooms with the single beds. But there were other words like fuckwit, which I think the genealogy of that word is clear. Smug married, that was a friend of mine that came up with that actually. And I think if we ever do the theatre version of Bridget Jones, which I hope we will, the lavatories will be labelled ladies and fuckwits.
When you make a character as successful as that, and then it was made into a film, what were the challenges of having to rewrite some of this, what is essentially an internal monologue, now that is a dialogue between the actor and the viewer? And did you feel at some point that it was all getting out of hand, that you had to work out a new set of limits to establish for what would be successful on screen for the same personality?
There were very few moments making the film when we didn't think everything had got out of hand. It was a very chaotic process on the first one. It's a completely different form. We were helped by having stolen the plot from Pride and Prejudice, because that's a well-researched plot, and it's been used in lots and lots of different forms. And so we were really solid on that. Nevertheless, the instinct in movies is to make everything be something else, and there's endless meetings with people saying, wait, why doesn't everyone be a camel? Or anything, it could be anything. So you really have to, for me, my job is not to be always around, I think. It's just to read the script every so often and get it back on course. Because tiny details of character can completely make you not like Bridget. And she's actually a good person. She's kind and she's moral, and she doesn't blame other people for things. She always blames herself, and she's good to her friends. If you take those things away, she starts to seem like a bit of a whinging, self-obsessed ninny, so you have to really stay on it. Dialogue, I think, again, I fight to keep the detail. Each character in the books has their own vocabulary. You know, the mum will say things like, "Darling, your tights are fighting your skirt," which no one else except the mum would say. And she always talks in food, you know, things are crushed raspberry or burnt apricot when she describes colours. So if they flatten all that out, it's not as much fun. So you have to stay on it. It's difficult making films. It's easier writing books.
Speaking of novelists coining new words, I wonder, Joshua, if the description of smartphones as me machines is something that you came up with or that you took from somewhere else. But in your new book, this is it's set in bizarrely in a dental clinic, and the protagonist is somebody who finds that mysteriously one day that his own business has a website that he never set up. Please tell us about how you put all these things together and what are me machines doing in the story.
The me machine is mine. I take credit for it. It hasn't caught on the way that I wished it to. You know, I think that it should be more popular, frankly. I kind of call my book now the first novel about fake news, because in some sense, my dentist, who is materially fine and has a thriving practice, you know, is pretty soul sick. He doesn't belong to any particular group. He's alienated from the rest of the world. His patients come in and they refuse to take care of their mouths. They have cavities and they won't floss, and he gets very frustrated. And so one day he is hanging out and discovers that somebody has created a Facebook page in his name, and is claiming that he belongs to a small sect. And that sect is sort of advertising oddly that, you know, while the Jews have been oppressed throughout history and they've been persecuted and killed, we are the Jews' Jew. We've suffered even more. And this appeals to his sense of collective longing, that he could be even more special than somebody who's been persecuted for years and years. So he joins the tribe, so to speak. And then, you know, it turns out that was all bullshit. But you know, the will to believe is very strong in him. So the fact that the facts don't pan out get trumped, no pun intended, by the meaning in his life that is, you know, brought to him by this sudden introduction to a new world that he didn't know existed. So I think what this is essentially about is the longing to belong in ways that, even though he looks as if he's quite successful and should be happy, he's also constantly staring at death through the bad teeth of his patients and needs something larger in his life than the billings and the repertoire that goes on between him and his staff.
I read it as a story about somebody who having worked out what he thinks about life, does not believe in God, but then at some point realizes that the greatest story of all is religion. That it's very impossible to avoid the power, not just of deity, but of the narrative power of religion. Yeah.
You know, I have a lot of friends who you know, you know the type, I suspect. They're philosophy majors. They're very smart, and they have all of the arguments worked out, and they're very convincing. They're all men. They're all very certain of their position, and they present the facts to you in a way that is bulletproof. It's invincible. And I always say, but, you know, I don't like the conviction. The conviction always makes me feel as if their certainty about the non-existence of God is just as dogmatic and troubling as the certainty of the existence of God. And so I find that, especially in fiction, where, you know, I feel as if my job is not necessarily to give you a full accounting of the facts, not to give you an argument of this or that, but to try to capture the illusions and the dreams and the confusions and the delusions of human beings. And some of that requires going against the evidence. Some of that requires setting aside the argument, setting aside the conviction, and embracing the irrational. Embracing the stupidity, frankly, of believing in God. I find this to be a perfectly legitimate stance to take.
Chika, the protagonist of Josh's novel does not believe, doesn't believe in God, but Adama, a character in one of your own books, goes through something even more disturbing. She finds out that she herself apparently does not exist when she wants to go with her boyfriend to a Christmas party. Don't you remember that bit where this man asks her, who would I say you were, because she's orphaned and she has no... could I possibly have got that wrong?
Which book is this?
Well, let's move to something else.
Okay, I'm sorry. I mean, I could be wrong. I haven't reread my books in years, so I don't know. I could be...
Well, I find it incredible that I'm even writing your books for you now. I've gotten to be so generous as a moderator. Well, tell us something about... one of the strange things about novels is how novels come to us and what languages they come to us is. I found it very unusual about you that your books were written in English, but they didn't, in the beginning, come out in English. They came out in translation. How was it that that quirk came about?
Well, I lived in Belgium 15 years, and I was I'm still very much a part of Belgian literary circle, and the way publishing houses work in Belgium is that, it's a very small country. Publishing houses are relatively small, so your publisher is your first reader, is your agent, is your editor, is everything. And the turnaround from submission of manuscript to publishing is very short. And so it's like maybe 3 months, 4 months, whereas in the UK and the US, it's a lot longer. So it's very practical reasons.
Michael, I wanted to ask you something about, not a lot gets said or spoken about editing in fiction. How does one know when one has written a draft of something, what is the principle by which to either cut or add to it? Is it different every time for you?
Well, my first draft, as I said earlier on, is I see it as a reconnaissance, but in the sense that I discover at the end of it what the story is about. But to get there, I've taken wrong turns, etc., etc., etc. So, and I also write by hand. So the first 4 or 5 drafts are all handwritten, and we were talking about the distance between the writer and the text. Whereas for me, with a handwritten text, I can have red inks crossing things out and sticking things on top of it. So it's a very active process and sensual process of writing and rewriting. And essentially is taking that first draft, and then various drafts occur, and things get changed, shortened, usually shortened. I make it about 2/3 the length. And I also discover what is missing, so I start putting in scenes. And often, and I don't really show the text to anyone until I think I've taken it as far as I can go. And at that point, I give it to 3 or 4 friends who are readers. And for instance, in Anil's Ghost, someone said they didn't like the character of Anil at the beginning. She sounded thoroughly objectionable and rude. And I was very fond of her. And then, so the problem was, it began with her landing at Katuna Airport in Colombo. And I'd written a section, which I dropped earlier on, about her working as a forensic anthropologist, and talking about the bodies she was discovering. So I pulled that out and made that the first scene. And that clarified her profession, it clarified her empathy. So suddenly that solved that problem. So it's a lot of cases of solving problems of what is missing. And also, what tends to happen in my books is that it may begin with one character, but then 4 or 5 others turn up at various points. And I have to kind of then balance them with each other, and And for me, a book is a kind of, not a monologue or a dialogue, but a group of people discussing things, and each one has a different point of view. And I've quoted this line before by John Berger, "Never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one." And I really believe this as an aesthetic and also as a political statement. And so that in whatever book I'm writing, the arguments are occurring between them as opposed to the voice of the narrator, And I think what we were saying earlier on also, how it's so important to listen, to listen to, as a writer, you learn by listening. And we are all kind of hearing what's happening next door. And that becomes, the voice becomes very important for me.
Josh, final question for you before we ask for questions from the audience. Is being a novelist, as much as being alert to your weaknesses as being alive to your strengths, when you look at drafts of your books and you're editing, do you find that there are words, for instance, that how much of it is about cutting out and working out what is superfluous?
Did you direct this question at me because you have particular editing suggestions? No, I'm joking. Something Amy said started me thinking about how, something about, you were talking about how that first book came. And my first book just came to me too. And since then, as you suggest, it's been nothing but pulling teeth. And I think that something that happened with me in that first book is, I had tried to work on it forever and ever. And I had finally set it down, and I said to my wife, it's time for me to get a job, a real job. And she said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, I think I'm going to join the NYPD. I'm going to become a police officer. And she said, you would make the worst police officer in the world. But I still went, and I took the test. And then we went down to Key West, and we got married. And upon coming back, I'd set the book down for about a year. And I started thinking about it, and I said, why wasn't it that book didn't work? And she said, I don't know. And she was reading a magazine. She went back to her magazine. And I got the first 2 or 3 sentences in my head. And I got up from the bed, and I started writing them. And 14 weeks later, that first book was written. And I had spent 2 or 3 years trying to finish it before then. There is something occult. Maybe it's only a first novel phenomenon, but there's something occult sometimes about writing a book. There are other books that seem to be all you're doing is banging your head against the wall to make them come. And if, there's a weird kind of negotiation that's going on between the overt conscious will to put a book out into the world, to be the best writer you can possibly be, and something else that's much more subterranean, much more primitive and intuitive that you can't quite access. And sometimes if you release, I find, if you release that willfulness, that very stubborn, what I like to think of as particularly male, ambitious desire to get a book out, and release that and allow it to be much more subtle and much more attuned to what it should be, it comes easier. And this, I think, is the case. Of course, in revision, it becomes a much more self-conscious experiment or process. But it's this case all the way throughout. It's a tug of war between the conscious and the unconscious. And I think most of the good stuff that comes out is unconscious.
Okay, who wants to ask questions? So many people. You, yes.
Hello, everybody. What would be your advice to those people who are good in writing blogs and those who can write a big post on Facebook and they want to write a book but till now they have not started, who can write like around 20-30 pages like stories?
Who are you? Are you asking this to someone in particular?
No, everybody, whoever wants to answer, and those people, including my kind of person, because
Okay.
I'm like that.
Who wants to answer the question? The question is for those who know how to write blog posts and write on a small scale, how do you grade up to writing a book?
just start and you continue. And you write every day, or as many.
We didn't get to this point about stamina in writing novels. Maybe so in that way, perhaps Chika, if you want to speak about that, she's actually asked quite a good question.
Yeah, I think different writers have got different methods. What works for me is that I give myself little goals and I reward myself at the end of the goals. So sometimes I tell myself, okay, I'm going to write 250 words today, every day until this is done. And if I do that, then I can buy these new shoes that I really want. And so there is that motivation at the end of, and that motivates me. But I find that writing every day helps, whether or not you think you have writer's block.
I think Maddox Ford said, all you have to do is write 500 words a day, and at some point walk on the grass. And he wrote many, many novels and nonfiction.
I spend a lot of time reading this book called On Writing by Hemingway. So I really wish I was him, because he had a theory that there was a muscle to writing, which is a bit like what you're saying, that you should write the same amount. You should write the same amount every day, and then your body will get used to it. And then you go off sport fishing, and then you come back the next day and correct what you did and write some more. But I found I can never do that, and I'm at the start of a novel, I'm in a state of total panic, and the only thing I can do is go to a cafe and remind myself, usually a cafe where other people are writing, and remind myself that I have had books published, and then that boosts my confidence enough to allow me to start. So I don't think anyone should ever feel that the sort of insecurity and terror of the beginning is unique to them. I think it's just a discipline of just doing it and get past that. It doesn't matter if what you write is rubbish, just get past it and get into the rhythm, and then it all gets a bit better.
Now, let's have some more questions, perhaps. You at the back there, yes, yeah.
Going beyond the actual experience of publishing a book that you're proud of, what does success do to your life? I'm curious about Helen in particular, because your character was struggling for, a sense of fulfillment, and, she's an existentialist sort of a creature. How did the success of Bridget Jones change your life, and how did it work for all of you, your first book?
Is there another definition of success beyond success in publishing?
Well, it was a real shock for me, and it was a great thing to happen, but it was an adjustment period, because I'd been a freelance journalist and I was really broke. So I didn't really understand what money meant. I thought if I went out and bought a pair of shoes, all the money would go away. So I kept life exactly the same for a long time, and then just only slowly changed it a bit. And I think that's quite important. In terms of writing, it made me really self-conscious, to the point that I can't write a Bridget book now unless I don't tell anyone and pretend that it's not actually real. So I just sit and write it completely in a secret fashion, and then only when it's finished, show it to someone, so that I can reproduce the same unself-consciousness I had when I first wrote it. Because honestly, if I'd known so many people were going to read it, I wouldn't have dared write it.
I'll just add that success is a nice thing, and the nice things come with it, but it's not like a room you go into. It's not like a special room you're granted access to, so that your life becomes sort of transcendent. I would almost say that success is like a foreign country. You can travel to it, but you remain the same person that you've always been. And in fact, you kind of want to come home and be more of that person that you've always been, and forget about the success, because the success can also be warping. I mean, when my first book came out, it sold well, I made money, but I also started to drink more. And so I thought, I'm either going to become an alcoholic or write a second book. And so I moved out of the city and wrote a second book. It's very easy to get derailed. So you have to navigate it. It's something you have to navigate. And you also have to remember that with it does not come some kind of heavenly transcendence. You remain the same person you always were, and it's the only way that new work is going to be any good.
I thought my first book would sell 5,000 copies and disappear from the shelves after 6 weeks. And I didn't understand what was happening, to the point that I cracked my teeth with the tension of not knowing. I'm somebody who needs a kind of control in my life. This was so completely out of control. I started finding reasons why it happened. For example, that I actually had ghosts who were guiding this and making people write it or notice it. Read this and notice it. So it was a very difficult time, and what I found with the danger, I didn't feel it was going into a different country at all. I felt like it was a constant danger that was going to destroy me, not just my writing, but me. And I wrote a list of principles in my life, things that were important, to remember not to deviate from that no matter what happened, I had to keep those. So it included things like not getting lured into glamorous endeavors such as Hollywood. And I did something with film, but that was it. I did it one time, and I'm never going to do it again. And I found that I had to constantly get rid of whatever made me self-conscious. So I don't read reviews anymore. And I don't read good reviews or bad reviews or articles about myself, because it's a reflection of what somebody else thinks of me or my books, and they can be very harmful. If you believe the good ones, you have to believe the bad ones. And so it's very funny to me when people say, well, are you happy with the way your book's doing? I say, I have no idea how it's doing. My publisher, my agent are forbidden from telling me this. And I think it's the only way I can be a writer, that I can do the kind of writing that I want. And yet, it is still incredibly difficult to get rid of what that self-consciousness is.
I think the success is also a journey. At least for me, it's a journey. And I think if you're ambitious, you never sort of ever really get there, because you're constantly, no matter what you have, you're constantly wanting more. And I'm a very, as a writer, I'm not very confident. So, whenever I start writing, I'm filled with self-doubt. The book comes out, I'm filled with self-doubt. I don't reread any of my works. So, you might have been right about the ghost thing, but I don't remember. But ironically, a certain level of success also makes me more confident as a writer. So I feel like, okay, I can really do this. I don't have to go to a plan B. I can sort of stay the course.
I think I was lucky that I began as a poet, because for most of the population, poetry and poets are invisible. So for the first 8 or 9 years of my writing life, I would get a review about 6 months down the line of about 2 or 3 lines long. And so I thought this, in fact, was the perfect state to be in. And I was teaching, so I wasn't relying on my poetry. I think if I had had a huge success with my first or second book, I would have been badly altered. But by the time I started to sell books, I think I was used to a certain kind of faith in what I was doing. So I think a gradual success is safer than a sudden one.
Some questions from the back. Yes. Yeah. Good. Right.
Hi. So what I wanted to ask was this particularly for Michael sir and also Helen. What I wanted to ask is what happens when there are rich characters, plot becomes sidelined, or they become plot devices otherwise. So how do you find the compatibility within the characters and the plot itself?
How do you work out how to make a character move into a plot?
That's quite an interesting question. I think I always find they're all mixed up together. So in a way, characters are plot. So the way that I write, I start off writing newspaper columns, and now I'm not. So the last few novels, what I've ended up with is a sort of splurge of material, an idea, these characters and things they're all doing together. That's a terrible, terrible mess. and then I do that in a cafe, so I'm feeling okay. And then when I've got that down, then I'll look at it and think, okay, what is this? So I think there's not that many stories, if you're writing the sort of books I'm writing, which are quite the lighter form of fiction, if you like. And so you're not going to have that many characters that can propel that story. So, for example, Pride and Prejudice is a triangular love story. Girl falls for false love and finds true love. So those three characters have to be central. And for me, it's really quite tight under the surface. So on the surface, it's like a little duck, it's bobbing along. But underneath, those little legs are going really fast. And it's very tightly structured. Everybody is doing a job and there for a reason. And only occasionally I'll just oversee something really funny that happens. Like I once walked into a shop and this woman was buying a swimsuit and she said, "Do you think this looks too inky for me?" And it was blue. And I said, "No, not really." And I just put that into a book for no reason. But otherwise I would be very strict about why the characters were there.
You want something that...
I find that, in fact, I don't know who the characters are when I begin a book. So that creates the plot in a way. I mean, a book like The English Patient began with a night conversation between two people, and I didn't know who they were when I began. I just was following the clues of who they might be, where they came from, what their relationship was. And I find, just as I don't, when I write a book, have specific characters in mind that I will use, I will invent the characters as I go along. So that becomes a part of the process of discovery and, I suppose, the plot.
Next, I've been very partial to the right wing. You.
Hi, my question is for Chika. You said that when you were researching your characters in Belgium, that you had to go and talk to them. And so how do you actually research characters for a book? Do you tell them that you are writing a book, or do you just eavesdrop?
No. So when I started researching on Black Sister Street, I went to a cafe called Ketucha, which is where a lot of Nigerian sex workers who are not working legally work out of. And I'm Nigerian, I have a Nigerian accent. And so I walked in there, and the first woman I spoke to, my very Catholic guilt, I wanted to be very honest with her. And I said, "Hi, I'm writing a book. My name is Chika, and I'm writing a book, and can I talk to you?" And she burst into laughter. And she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Nigeria." She said, "Where do you live?" I said, "Here." She said, "Your husband, is he a white man?" I said, "Yes." And she said, "And you're a writer?" I said, "Yes." And her attitude was like, "Yeah, right, pull the other one. Of course you're a prostitute like I am, or you're a new girl wanting to come in, And so I realized that could actually work for me. And so I stopped saying that I was a writer, because, in their worldview, if you're a certain age and you're a woman and you're from Nigeria, you can't be anything else but a sex worker. And so the conversations were very, organic and very smooth and because they felt like they were talking to one of theirs. Yeah.
Last question. Yes, you have been.
Hi, my question is for Amy, ma'am. So you said that your first book was actually the easiest book for you to write because you had all these questions inside of you that you needed to answer for yourself. What happens when there are too many questions that you have inside of you, and finding a proper channel for them, finding a proper outlet just seems impossible. So you're just stuck in a head with a story, but it's not coming out. There are too many questions.
They find their ways into other books. It's not that they're literally questions, like there's a list of them. They form. It's almost like looking at character and saying, I need to understand this person better. And so now I can move to another layer. The questions I had then are not the questions I have now. somehow they do get embedded into the story. So it's not a direct answer. The next books, though, the questions themselves come in the way of a mystery, like an image with all kinds of history embedded into it that keeps changing. It is the same image, but it keeps changing and taking on a deeper understanding, different facets. And within that, the questions arise. I'm not aware of it until I start writing.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for all our panelists.
Huge thanks to Amy Tan, Chika Unigwe, Helen Fielding, Joshua Ferris, Michael Ondaatje, and moderator Chandrahas Choudhury. This session was presented by Amity University, and the authors have confirmed that they're happy to sign books. So please do go to the Full Circle bookshop, pick up copies of their books and meet them at the book signing area. You'll find the book signing tent at the far left corner of the Bank of Baroda front lawn. The next session, starting here in 15 minutes, is called